Amen. All right, we're in Romans this morning and didn't get very far last week. And I got sidetracked really bad. Hey, we got internet. My wife's a genius, I'm telling you. The only stupid decision you ever made in her life is standing right here in front of you. Other than that, everything she's done is imperfect. Well, I'll tell you how I did that. We went to Graham, and, there was only like 25 kids in the whole school, so, she had a pool to pick from, you know what I'm saying? So, that's how I did it. That's a good way to go, ain't it? Ain't that right? It's a lot easier to catch a big fish in a little pond sometimes, right? Because they ain't got much else to eat, but, they ain't got much else to get but what you give them, so. All right, that's as good as it gets this morning. We're going downhill from there. All right, so we got in chapter 2 a little bit, and, I got kind of sidetracked a little bit last week, and as I do. But I guess maybe I was kind of trying to put this off a little bit because I feel like this is a part of Romans that people really, really struggle with, and it's not a part that we really spend a lot of time on or maybe think a lot about, but it really brings up some interesting thoughts and about Gentiles and Jews and laws and consciousness. That's a weird word, isn't it? Conscious. We always think about it. Every time I think about it, I think about little Jiminy Cricket, on Pinocchio, right? Maybe he wasn't a very good influence, all in all. But it's kind of that idea, where does that come from? Where do we get an idea of right and wrong and justice and is that something we're born with? Do you think we're born with a conscience? Do you think we train it? The Bible tells us we should train our heart, and that's kind of that idea in the Bible, psyche, kind of that idea. But we think a lot about that, don't we? How do we know? Somebody, if we was born on an island where nobody was, and there was a half a dozen of us, and it's one of them hypotheticals, we all grew up on that island and we didn't have anything to teach us and anything to tell us what was right or wrong. Would we figure that out? We figure out right and wrong. What would we have a moral compass, basically, if there was no one to tell us what was right, what was wrong? That's a tough question, isn't it? And so Paul kind of dives into that a little bit in this chapter 2 of Romans, the idea of our own right and wrong, our own righteousness, so to speak, without the law. So I think 11, there's no partiality with God. That's a big thing for Paul to say that, because the Jews were God's chosen people. God gave them the law. God chose them over every other race on the earth. God chose them to give them the law. And then Paul comes along and says there's no partiality. That seems pretty partial to me. That God just said, we're going to give you the law. We're not going to give everybody else the law. So what do you think Paul means by that, no partiality idea? What do you think he's getting at? So we're in Rome, right? There's a lot of Gentiles here, a lot of Greeks, a lot of Jews, pretty diverse group of people. And the Jews think they kind of got it figured out because they got the law of God, law of Moses, right? They got that. And there's law of the land, Roman law in the land, so there's we might say a certain amount of maybe legal guidance, I guess. I don't know how much that would be. But what do you think Paul means? What kind of partiality do you think? He says, he says, peace and honor to everyone who does good, to the Jew and the Greek, for there's no partiality with God. What do you think he's trying to tell him here? Yeah, just being a Jew in itself doesn't give you, just because you can say I'm a Jew, I'm a descendant of Abraham, does not necessarily make you a righteous person, right? And just because you go ahead, Gary. Yeah, this is a different time, and I think you're right. I think he's saying this is different. And, I'm not saying that you're better. The Jew's not necessarily better than anybody else. The Greek, he says here. Partiality. It's a lot deeper than that to me with God. The idea of no partiality. Because if that's true, then it kind of flies a little bit in the face of predestinationalism. In other words, the idea that people are predestined. If there's no partiality, then God doesn't really predestine people to things. So what does he get into this? All who have sinned without the law will perish, and all who have sinned under the law will be judged. And this is the law of Moses, right? All who have sinned without the law will perish without the law. And all who have sinned under the law will be judged by the law. So that goes into that no partiality idea, right? In other words, you're all gonna, if you sin, you're all gonna perish. You're either gonna perish or you're gonna be judged. God's not gonna let anybody get off free, basically. God's not gonna let anybody get off without some sort of, so in other words, the law in itself will not save you. Being a Jew in itself will not save you. Those things will not save you in and of themselves. Because it's not the hearers of the law, but the doers of the law, right? Paul would say. It's not the hearers who are just, but the doers will be just. For when Gentiles, and this is where it gets a little more confusing. This is where people struggle a little bit. For when Gentiles who do not have the law, not a law, the law of Moses, do instinctively the things of the law, these not having a law are a law to themselves. Well, I've had so many discussions over this verse. You have no idea. What does that mean? What does that mean? To be a law unto yourself. What's he trying to say here? I've had people say, well, Rex, what he's doing is he's trying to make the Jews feel bad, because basically he's saying these Gentiles who basically didn't have anything and they did it anyway, they're really making you look bad because you had it and you didn't do it. So they're really making you look bad. Paul's really kind of throwing it in your face that even though you had it, you couldn't keep it. And these people who had it, they did it anyway and they didn't even have it. So you ought to kind of be ashamed of yourself. Now some people look at it that way. And some people look at this verse and they say, well, what that means is that even the people who didn't have the law could be saved because they were a law unto themselves. In other words, this carries all the way back, and even good people who lived in the old, under the Old Testament, lived years before Christ, even all these people, that if they were moral and good and had this law unto themselves, that God didn't show any partiality. In other words, God didn't just say, oh, well, just the Jews can go because I gave them the law. God still allowed other righteous people to be saved or to be righteous, because even though they didn't have the law, they were a law unto themselves, you see. Well, okay, so I don't know what you think about that. I've had this discussion a lot. And when you get in that discussion, you kind of start thinking about the people in the Old Testament who were justified that weren't Jews. Can you think of any of those people? Yeah, Moses, right? Moses was justified. How about people after the law? Yeah, Noah was righteous, right? But that was all pre-law, right? So what about people after the law who were, household of Cornelius, what a great example, right? Cornelius was judged righteous by God. He wasn't a Jew. What about Rahab, the harlot? Rahab was justified by her actions, even though she wasn't technically a Jew. I think she proselyted into that, obviously, But, so I don't know. You see, yeah, go ahead, Sam. Well, it could. I think he gets a little deeper into this. They show the work of the law written in their hearts, their conscience bearing witness, their thoughts and alternately accusing or else defending them. Right. How can you follow a law? Yeah. So what you're trying to say, Brent, is that, see, this is a big argument, right? So what you're trying to say is that God will not hold you responsible for something you don't know. God's a just God. So, see, that's a difficult argument. So, because I understand the principle of it, and I think there's a reality to it. And this was a big deal, and I'm a big church history guy. You know that. I love church history. And there was an interesting thing that happened, and with Alexander Campbell. So, Alexander Campbell was raised Presbyterian. And at the time that Alexander Campbell, they started this deal, right? This church, they started meeting, let me put it that way. And, Alexander Campbell had this, he really wanted to get back to the original text. That was kind of his thing. He wanted to really do what, in his mind, he wanted to do it the way God really wanted him to do it. He had a real desire for that. He was a very, very intelligent man. And so he kind of came up with this, studying the Bible, and they came up with this idea of baptism, immersing, Because the time of Alexander Campbell and Presbyterian, they didn't, basically nobody immersed anybody, and most people baptized infants. Adult baptism wasn't really a big thing. And Alexander Campbell, of course, grew up in that religion. And if you look back over centuries of Catholicism, centuries of Greek Orthodox Catholicism, for centuries, we didn't immerse adults. We just baptized babies. And so Alexander Campbell was really tore about that. He kind of resisted the idea of even being baptized as an adult or being immersed as an adult, even though he believed and had studied and knew that's what the scriptures told him to do. He resisted that because he felt like by him admitting that and by him doing that, he was basically condemning centuries of people, because basically the way we read text and the way I believe, is that baptism is what adds you to the Lord's body. Baptism is actually what saves you, to be immersed into Christ. That's the point where that actually occurs. And if you've never had that done, then biblically speaking, you've never actually been added. So in Alexander Campbell's line of reasoning was that, if he admitted to that he would basically be condemning all those centuries of people. Basically, he could say the church didn't exist for centuries because nobody was actually immersed into the body of Christ for centuries. And so that was a big thing. And as he studied that and really looking at Romans here, in Romans 2, he came to this conclusion, and I wish I had the quote in front of me, and I can't quote it. I can't quote it verbatim. But he had this, basically puts this quote, and basically the premise of it, and I wish I had it. The premise of it was basically that, we're only held accountable for the law that's entrusted to it, for what the knowledge that's entrusted to us, was kind of his premise, was that if you didn't know, and there was no way to know, you couldn't be held accountable for what was not entrusted to you, what you didn't have access to or didn't know. Now, the theory of that is difficult because there's a couple of things in the Bible, and I'm just trying to play devil's advocate here, but there's a couple of things that if you really look at it from a logical standpoint, it kind of bothers you a little bit. And one of those things is this. There's a place in the Bible, right? We know the scripture that says, it would be better for you to never have known the way than to have known it and turned from it, right? And so I remember there's a story. Guy was telling somebody about Jesus, or traveling in a car. He's having this conversation, and he's trying to tell him about Jesus Christ and God, and this person basically is resistant to that. And at the end of this conversation, the person says, well, he says, I know what you're telling me. I know you're trying to tell me about Jesus and salvation and God. He says, basically, I just don't really believe what you're telling me, and I don't want to have anything to do with it, and you're not going to convert me, and I just wish you'd just leave me alone. And so the guy then that was trying to convert him, basically, he looked at him and he said, well, I wish I'd have never told you, because now that I've told you and you rejected it, it's going to be worse for you. And there's a little bit of biblical principle to that, right? For instance, in his eyes. But there is a little bit of biblical principle to that. And so the idea is that, once we know something, then we have a responsibility to act upon the knowledge that we possess. Would you agree with that? Once you know something, you have a responsibility to act upon the knowledge that you possess. But if you don't have that knowledge, if you're ignorant to that knowledge, then do you still have that responsibility? So the conundrum is that by sharing that knowledge with people, do you condemn them? That's an interesting thought. In other words, if I just let the whole world be ignorant and not tell them anything, then they wouldn't be responsible for anything, right? And that really doesn't make any sense either. So it's kind of a difficult conundrum, isn't it, when it comes to that idea? And Paul kind of broaches that, okay? I'm not saying he doesn't. And we broached that earlier when he talks about the idea that creation speaks of God and that basically we don't have an excuse not to seek knowledge, right? So in the end of the argument, I think you have to understand that we have a responsibility to seek knowledge, to not be ignorant people. And once we obtain knowledge, then we have a responsibility to act upon the knowledge that we attain. So I think it's one of those things that it kind of puts the responsibility back upon the person. We have a responsibility to obtain knowledge. We have a responsibility to seek God. We have a responsibility to make this thing work. And it's not just on the person that's speaking to us to give us knowledge. We have a responsibility to try to obtain that knowledge, to try to grow in that knowledge, to try to understand the things of God. We have a responsibility to do that. So it's kind of a weird kind of an argument, kind of a circular argument. But Paul, when he gets into this, he is really speaking about something that we have to think a lot about. A law unto ourselves, right? You can't rely upon the name Jew, Paul would say. You can't rely upon the fact that you're a descendant of Abraham. That's no longer going to save you, right? If you are so confident in yourself, and once again, very satirical statement, which is very Paul-like, very satirical statement. If you're confident of yourself, a guide to the blind, a light to those in darkness, a corrector of the foolish, a teacher of the immature, having in the law the embodiment of knowledge and truth, you therefore who teach another, do you not teach yourself? In other words, do you look at yourself? You teach, but do you look at yourself? Are you a law unto yourself? Are you relying on just the fact that you're a Jew to make you righteous? Or do you understand that you have to do these things, you have to live these things in order to be a righteous person? Do you understand that, right? That's a difficult idea, difficult question, difficult thought, because it plays into a lot of what Paul is trying to say, is that, just to have knowledge and not act upon it, just to have a law and not obey it, is not going to save you. It's not going to make you righteous, because you aren't doing what you know to do. You're not acting upon the knowledge that you possess. There was a guy I listened to, a Christian comedian, and I just love this story. Matter of fact, I've even thought about actually trying to play this clip actually a couple of times in my class, because I love this clip, because he loves to golf. He's a real golfer. He just loves to golf, and so this guy that he knows invites him to this really swanky golf course that costs a lot of money, and he doesn't have any money. And so he invites him to go play golf, and he knows this guy's a Christian, but he goes, well, he says, I really want to play golf, and it's a really nice golf course, and there's no way I can afford to play here. So he takes the guy's invitation. They're out playing golf, and the guy, they get along, and so this conversation, I kind of know where this conversation is going to go, as we're playing golf. So they're playing golf, and the guy eventually asks him, he goes, what do you think about Jesus? What do you think about Jesus Christ? And he says, I'm just going to shut this down right now. So he looks at him, he goes, well, I'm just an atheist. He says, I don't believe in God at all, So they go along playing a little bit. So finally the guy, he says, that's interesting, that you're an atheist. And he says, I guess you've studied all the religions of the world, and you've come to the conclusion that God doesn't exist. And he says, well, no. He says, really haven't studied. He said, really haven't studied anything. He says, I just don't believe in God. And he looks at him and he says, you're not an atheist. He says, you're just lazy, right? And that's always stuck with me, because it's really easy for somebody to say I'm an atheist, because when you do that, you remove yourself from the equation. Does that make any sense? You remove yourself from the discussion. You remove yourself from having to make any other decision about anything else about God, because you've made the decision that God just simply doesn't exist. And once you do that, you removed yourself from the equation. I don't have to worry about that anymore, right? My mother worked for Bell for years, and she was going across Kansas in a Bell car, in a company car. And Kansas is God-forsaken anyway, but she's going across Kansas. It's the middle of the night. Back in those days, stations didn't stay open like they do now, and it was hard to find gas sometimes at night. And she's just running on fumes, and she says, and she's recounting the story to one of her coworkers, and she goes, man, I'm watching this gas gauge. It's going further and further. I'm not going to make it. I'm out here by myself in the middle of nowhere, middle of Kansas, which is the same thing. She says, I'm out here in the middle of nowhere, and I'm running out of gas. And she says, I'm just, scared to death. I'm just watching that gas gauge. I'm scared to death. I'm going to run out. She goes, finally, I see the lights. Finally, I get gas. And the guy she's telling to, she says, well, that happened to me one time too. Out there, same deal, out in Kansas, middle of the night, couldn't get gas. She goes, what did you do? He goes, I just turned my dash lights off. In other words, if I can't see it, it doesn't exist, right? So I just turned my dash lights off. I don't worry about it, And so I think that's what we do as people. Sometimes we just turn the dash lights off, and if we do that, we don't have to address, we don't have to worry about it, we don't have to talk about it, we don't have to discuss it. But that's really not the definition of an atheist, is it? I mean, to truthfully say you're an atheist, you have to have the knowledge, you have to possess the knowledge, you have to come to a logical conclusion that God simply does not exist. To truly be an atheist, that's what you have to do. You can't just decide God's not there. I mean, that's not truthfully an atheist. That's just a lazy person that doesn't want to pursue any type of knowledge, and that's the way out, right? And so when I think about this passage, I think about that. That's what I think about a lot of times. You can be lazy. You can be a lazy Christian. You can be a lazy Jew. Isn't that what Paul was saying? You can be a lazy Jew. You can basically say, well, I'm a Jew. I got the law. I'm God's chosen person. It doesn't matter what I do. God's going to take me. Right? And you can be a lazy Christian. You can be a person who gets it, who's baptized into Christ, who becomes a Christian, and then just says, well, I've got it, I've been baptized, I've been saved, I'm done. And so, but Paul's saying that doesn't work. I mean, that's what I get out of this passage, because it's not what you think. It's not what you say. It's not necessarily what you believe. It comes down to what you do, to how you live. You can't say I'm a Jew. You can't rely on that. Paul dives back into circumcision because we kind of started with that thought, right? He dives back into that, and he says circumcision is what? He says it's not who's physically circumcised, right? He says, if so, the uncircumcised man keeps the requirements of the law, will not his uncircumcision be regarded as circumcision? And he who is physically uncircumcised, if he keeps the law, will he not be judged? Will he not judge you through having the letter of the law, and circumcision are a transgressor of the law? Not that he's going to stand in judgment over them, but his life judges them. And I think that's a really big thing. Paul really is trying to drive this home to them and trying to get rid of the separation between Jew and Gentile, between Jew and Greek, and kind of bring it down to this idea. It goes right back to that idea there's no partiality, but then he goes into this idea of knowledge and seeking knowledge and having a knowledge and a conscience that's trained, and then doing it and not just hearing it, and then the idea that uncircumcision could judge the circumcised. That's really big for a Jew, right? An uncircumcised man can judge a circumcised. Not that he's going to stand in judgment over them, but because his life is a judgment of them. In other words, he's living a better life. He's living a more godlike life than this person who's circumcised, because this person who's circumcised is relying on his status as a Jew to save him, and that's just not going to work. So it's a really big concept, and I think Paul's really trying to drive that home to them. Circumcision is not outward. A Jew, but he is a Jew who is one inwardly. And circumcision is that which is of the heart, by the Spirit, not by the letter. And his praise is not from men, but from God. And so we get this idea of that. So Paul doesn't necessarily take it away from Judaism here. But he kind of defines what a Jew is, and why? I guess you have to kind of ask yourself, why is that important? Why does it say he is a Jew who is one inwardly? We don't consider ourselves to be Jews, I don't think, but Israel, right? It all comes back to that idea, and it all goes back to the end of Galatians 3, right? In other words, you baptized into Christ will clothe yourself with Christ. You're all one in Christ, and your heirs according to the promise of Abraham. Israel was restored, and that's what people miss, is that Israel has been restored. Israel exists today, but it's not physical Israel. It's spiritual Israel. It's ones who are children of Abraham because of the promise of faith, not because of circumcision or because of blood or because of lineage. And so Paul wants to do that, and he wants to take away that division that existed between them because of these people who said, oh, I'm Abraham's descendant, I'm a Jew, I'm just a little bit better than you, know a little bit more than you, a little bit smarter than you, a little bit more godly than you. And Paul's saying, no, that's not true. Because even though you say you're a Jew, you don't keep the law. These people are doing it even though they're not a Jew. You can't make that argument anymore. Any comments? What, keeping? Well, Sam kind of talked about that a little bit, but we might say the law of liberty, the law of Christ, the law of righteousness. We don't live, we as Christians, we still live under a law, I believe. I don't believe we're exempt from that. We don't live under the law of Moses per se, but we live under the law of liberty, which is probably harder to live by and harder to understand. Right, we're not exempt. All right. So what advantage is there to being a Jew after all this? Or what's the advantage of circumcision for that matter? So Paul's just kind of tore him down. He's just kind of tore him down in chapter 2. He's kind of tore him apart. He says, you're no better. These Gentiles are probably better than you, right? Because they're living a better life than you are, and they ain't got the law, and now being a Jew, So what's the advantage of it, What's the advantage of even being a Jew? Would you be? Yeah. Uh-huh. Right. Yeah. I know this is kind of a bad thought, but I was sitting in a class one time, long time ago. Red Coleman was teaching it, and Red was teaching this class, and he said, he used that passage, he says, well, God's long-suffering to us, we're not willing that any should perish, but all should come to repentance. And, I'm sitting in class, I'm probably in my 20s, right? And I'm sitting in this class, and I kind of raised my hand, and he goes, yeah, and I said, well, there's more people going to be lost than saved, right? And he says, yeah. And I said, well, it seems like by God prolonging the days of the earth that he's just condemning more people to hell than he is saving them. In other words, if he would just end it now, you know what I mean? There'd be a lot less people lost. Not more people saved, but there'd be a lot less people lost because more people are going to be lost than saved. But there'd be less people saved too. And, but it was just a thought I had as a young person, and it kind of goes back to what we're talking about in a way, What's the advantage of knowing Christ? Why do we share the gospel? Is it, what's the advantage of, if you could just not know anything, I don't know exactly where that leaves you eternally. I'm not 100% sure where that leaves you, But what's the advantage of Jesus Christ? What's the advantage of knowing Christ? Well, salvation, assured salvation, right? For one thing, right? That you know that you're going to be saved. But I think it's more than that. It's peace and it's joy and it's, there's advantages to Jesus in this life. And I always look towards the next life. I always think, eternity, and that's true. But to know Jesus is such a great advantage in every way. And to share the knowledge of that with somebody, especially someone who accepts that knowledge and believes it, is a wonderful experience. To see that look in their eyes, to know that they have a hope, beyond this. I know what Paul says in Corinthians, right? He says, if we have hope in this life only, we're of all men most miserable. If we have hope in Christ in this life only, we're of all men most miserable. But I kind of agree and disagree with that statement. You know what Paul's saying? Because that's a resurrection passage, right? 1 Corinthians 15. I mean, he's wanting us to look towards that resurrection. He's wanting us to look towards a hope beyond here. If we have hope in this life only, we're of all men most miserable. But I would kind of hate to live this life without that hope. Does that make any sense? Yeah. Yeah, I knew a true atheist in my life. Probably one of the few true atheists I knew in my life was Lucille Somerville. She was my adopted brother's grandmother. And she was the definition of a true atheist. She was a very intelligent, very smart woman who had literally come to the conclusion that God did not exist. She lived her life that way. And she was one of the nicest, cleanest, most put together, good member of society you would ever meet in your entire life. And but she's at the point of death, and her Richie, her son from California, flies in, and you know, the nurse, you know, a lot of times if people are at the point of dying, the doctor or nurse will come in and they'll say, you know, you need to give them permission to leave. You know, I don't know if you've ever heard that, but tell them it's all right, you know. So he tells Richie, he goes, you need to go into your mother, she's at the point of death. He goes, you need to tell her it's all right, you know, tell her it's all right. So she's, I don't know if you've ever sat with anybody that's dying, but she's at the point of death. She's gasping for air, you know, her mouth's open, she's not there, she's not coherent. So Richie goes in and, you know, and he says, Mom, he says, it's all right, you know, it's all right, you can go. And Richie said she just opened her eyes and clear as a bell. She goes, that's easy for you to say. And I'll never forget that, you know. That's easy for you to say, you know. You're not the one laying here dying, you know, fixing to find out what eternity is. But, and that's always a story that stuck with me because she was truthfully, she was quite the woman, but she was truthfully one of the purest, truest atheists I ever knew in my life. But I remember that, and she goes, that's easy for you to say, and that's always stuck with me, you know. So anyway, I'll leave you with it. Thanks for your time this morning.